after me in a nice loud voice. Africa!
Africa!
Africa is the second largest continent in the world. It is the home of one of the world's oldest civilizations, ancient Egypt. Africa.
Everybody repeat after me. Atlantic Ocean!
Atlantic Ocean! The Atlantic Ocean is one of the largest bodies of water in the world. It borders the western coast of Africa. The Atlantic Ocean, referred to as the Middle Passage, was the route used by hundreds of ships that brought the Western African from his homeland to the New World, where they were made slaves. The Atlantic Ocean.
Everybody say, Jamestown!
Jamestown! In 1619, the first Africans to be made slaves arrived in the American colonies. They were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. Jamestown.
Everybody say, freedom!
Freedom is being able to think what you want to think, say what you want to say, go where you want to go, live where you want to live, and be what you want to be. Freedom was the dream of the African slave, and one day that dream became a reality. Freedom.
Believe it or not, your participation helps us in our journey this evening in checking out the origins and the beginnings of jazz music. You actually helped us to demonstrate two of the three most important characteristics of Western African music. And one of the characteristics is call and response. As John called out to you, you responded to him. And the music of Western Africa is a communal music. The head of the household sings to the family, and the family answers. The chief sings to the people of the village, and the village answers. The priest sings to the congregation, and the congregation answers. And I know that you have had that experience of call and response in your churches and in your synagogues. The second thing that we had, though we only have two people right now to help us with it, is the characteristic of what we call polyrhythms. Now, poly means many, and rhythms mean rhythms. And polyrhythms, when you hear that wonderful sound that's Latin, or that wonderful sound that's African, that sound is actually made up of a combination of many other sounds. Rhythms, all different rhythms that are going on against one another at one time, like listening to people chatting all at once, if you will. And that polyrhythmic characteristic is very important, and we'll see more about that in just a little bit. The last characteristic, which we didn't do in our opening, is the importance of improvisation, spontaneity. Improvisation is the life breath, if you will, of jazz improvisation, and actually is a very important tool for all folk singers. It's that spontaneous creation of music. But right now, I'd just like to give you a little bit of background in the beginnings and the origins of jazz music. The word Renaissance means rebirth or reawakening. And that is why historians, when evaluating the evolution of world history, labeled the years between 1400 and 1600 the Renaissance. The reason why they did this, in looking at this period, we see it as very important in the overall movement of history, because the Renaissance brought Europe out of the Dark and Middle Ages and into a new era. For example, those years between 1400 and 1600, it was discovered that the blood circulated in the human body. They found out that the earth was round and not flat. and there was the development of the science of astronomy. We see Europe with bringing explorers to the New World. The European nations sponsored these explorers, sending them to the New World looking for land and riches. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there were 4 European slave trading nations: Spain, Portugal, France, and Great Britain. The Africans brought to the New World were Western Africans because the Atlantic Ocean borders the western coast of Africa. Where those nations landed in the New World determined the African's new environment and how he adjusted to that environment. It is interesting that the Portuguese and the French and the Spanish allowed their Africans to play their music just as they did in Africa, even allowing them to play their drums. The British, however, who brought the Africans to the entire eastern coast where the American colonies were, did not allow the Africans to play their drums. It was known that the Africans could communicate with the drums, and if they were allowed to do so, there would be no way of controlling revolution or insurrection by the slaves. It is important to remember that jazz music sprang up from the roots of folk music, and folk music is music of the people and by the people. The antebellum or pre-Civil War African American music was spirituals, work songs, field horrors, and camp songs. The Africans, slaves, came from a highly religious culture. Their religion was pantheistic, and the name of the group of gods is called the Orisha. The African had a great respect for his religion. And as the slaves lived through the horrible, cruel hardships of slavery, we find that they gravitated to Christianity, which was introduced to them by the missionaries. They could identify with Jesus and the cross. They could identify with suffering. And they could identify with the concept of heaven and the rewards and blessings they would receive there because of their earthly sorrows. After the Civil War, things greatly changed. The South was now facing the Reconstruction after the war. Hundreds of free slaves began to migrate to the North and to the East. The country was beginning to shift from a rural and agricultural nation to a nation of cities. And to add to that pot, with the turn of the 19th century moving into the 20th century, you had Henry Ford, who of course built his automobile factory in Detroit, which brought still more hundreds of people from the South into Detroit. And those who didn't settle in Detroit went to Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, or any of the other cities that dotted the North and the East. New Orleans is credited with being the birthplace of jazz. We find that in New Orleans, the first jazz bands were born, the Dixieland Band, so to speak. The Dixieland Band was a small band of musicians who learned to play their instruments by rote. None of them were schooled musicians, nor could they read music. And they played for festivals and parties and funerals. The Dixieland Band is really the first, one of the first real jazz concepts that we have in the beginnings of jazz in our country. When you start moving to the city, you have people who need entertainment, they need booze, prostitution, gambling, music, they need all of that. And what happens, and what happens is that eventually the economy of New Orleans caused the musicians to leave also, to go upstream, if you will, up the Mississippi to Chicago to play, to venture out to the other cities further east. And after the Civil War also, at the end of the 19th century, we find that the first real jazz form is what we call the blues. Now, the blues to jazz music is what the symphony or the sonata is to Eurocentric music. It is a basic form. I've had the experience of going to festivals and performing in festivals with musicians, and none of us spoke the same language. They couldn't speak much English, I couldn't speak much French or much Spanish or much Italian, but the minute somebody said blues, we all could speak the same language. And the blues has a particular structure, and so anywhere you go, we know what blues is. A little after that, we have the ragtime music, and they call that ragtime music because the rhythm of ragtime is, you might say, raggedy. You know, you have a march and it's 1, 2, 1, 2, and you have a waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. There's a rhythmic balance. But ragtime just took those rhythms and sort of upset them, pushed them off balance, so you never knew what was coming. And that was one of the delights of hearing that music. As we get into the mid-20s and the 30s, we get into what we call the swing era or the big band era. This was wonderful because the jazz that was being developed in that time was being developed in a band. Basie, Duke Ellington, Fletcher Henderson, Jimmy Lunsford, Paul Whiteman, Glenn Miller, all these bands, and people went to the dance halls to dance. That was my mother's and father's generation, and they went there to dance, and all the great things that were happening as a development of jazz, that was happening in the dance band. Then the Second World War came along. The guys went off to war, and things were never quite the same. That was really the end of the swing or big band era, if you will. But something very interesting started to happen. At the beginning of the 1940s and up until the mid-40s, when the Second World War ended, there became a new group of musicians, young and energetic, and wonderful virtuosos on their instruments, and with a terrific, highly developed intellectual sense of playing music. They were very young and they were very ambitious, and they were creating a music that could not work within the framework of a dance band with its rigid rhythms and beats. And among these wonderful musicians, we had such people as Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and Dexter Gordon. As a matter of fact, Dexter Gordon's widow was here tonight. These are all the giants. Sonny Rollins, Bud Powell, all of these wonderful people who played and who created a whole new music. Dizzy, as a matter of fact, gave the term bebop to this music because we were now entering the atomic age. Remember, the atomic bomb had been dropped at the end of the Second World War, and everything seemed fast and frantic. And Dizzy, in his own crazy individual way, said, it's bebop. That's what it is. It's bebop. The whole pace of the society is bebop. And that name stuck as far as describing that music. And after bebop, of course, we had such wonderful people as John Coltrane. I didn't even mention Miles Davis when I was mentioning the wonderful musicians of the bebop period. And we've had progressive jazz, fusion jazz, rock jazz, electronic jazz, you name it. Everybody's had a label for every kind of music that has come along that is jazz related or grew out of what we call jazz. We have to remember also that there are offshoots from what we consider to be jazz, basically. They are such musics as salsa and samba and reggae and rhythm and blues and rock and roll. And yes, God help us, rap and hip hop, okay? It's all part of it. It's all part of, they're all offshoots, if you will, of those Western African roots. That's where it's all grounded.